Katie, thank you so much for coming on this visual podcast. I've been fangirling you for a while, so I'm really excited that we were able to do this remotely. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. I was about to say sheltering from the storm, but it's not currently raining. So yes, but very happy to be working from home on a Friday.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you say sheltering from the storm because you actually have to go into the office a few times a week.
I do 4 days, which feels like a lot compared to friends who work in some other industries. I don't know. I think newspapers, that is quite common at the moment. And I feel lucky that we're not doing 5 days, to be honest, compared to some places. But 4 days in the office. And I do like that. I like to separate work and home as much as possible. But I do feel like I'm normally crawling into Thursday and therefore ready to be at home on a Friday. So yes.
And do you find hyper productive right now? So on average, people are on their emails 3 hours a day. I find that maybe given that you're a writer and an editor, which we'll get into, and then having to manage emails must be quite annoying, especially when you've got the commute add on top of it.
Yes, I do constantly feel like my inbox is like a secondary job, and it could be a full-time job if I let it, and I try not to let it. But that's the thing about writing, right? You need to be in the zone, and I know every job you need that, but I do think particularly writing, you need that time in the zone, and it's very easy to just be constantly distracted by pop-ups at the side of your screen, and offices are distracting enough as it is. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a challenge, and I'm lucky in that I've had such a broad remit in features at the Evening Standard, and I can get into that in more detail. But I think the downside of that is that I've got people from every type of side of features getting in touch, and people getting in touch about sides of journalism that I actually don't write about anymore. And so I think that's just the nature of being in a job for so long.
I think a title like senior features editor at the Evening Standard is quite not a bold, just a bold title, but also it's a little bit of a spicy title. I don't really know what it means. So I'd love it if you could break down not only what it means, but how did you get there?
Yes, of course. I'll take you way back. It's probably easiest. And actually, yeah, I'm really lucky. I've had a very varied career, but I think even my closest friends and family sometimes get a bit confused about what my remit covers, because it seems to be from the outside anything and everything. So I started my career at the Daily Mail as a news trainee. So they're one of the few papers that still has a graduate scheme. I'm going to be honest, I hadn't grown up reading the Daily Mail, wanting to work at the Daily Mail. It was not somewhere I ever saw myself. But I went to City University and did a newspaper journalism master's, which I know is a really, really common route into journalism. And it was there that I realized it was, suddenly became very obvious that is the route in. Doing that Daily Mail trainee course opens all kinds of doors. And I was lucky enough to get on it, and it did open lots of doors, and it's safe to say it toughened me up. It taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about what I did want to do in journalism, and a lot about what I didn't. And it taught me those raw skills, those raw sort of newsy skills. And even though I'm in features today, those skills come in a lot, actually. Even from my course, actually, but shorthand and things like that, I still use. Some of the media law stuff, some of the sort of interviewing techniques and things were really helpful. So I did 2 years there at the Daily Mail, and then moved across to the Evening Standard on features. So that was quite a jump. I still feel incredibly lucky that the Standard took this big punt on me, because it was a punt. I did have great news skills at that point, but writing features is a very, very different gig. So the thought that they clearly saw potential in an interview and took me on, I still feel very lucky to have had, because I think a lot of people try to get into features for years, and features at the Standard is one of the best jobs out there, in my opinion, because you just get to see all the best bits of London and the most interesting bits of London. And features can be a very broad remit wherever you are, but I think particularly in the 7 years I've been at the Standard, it's really broad. So to explain a bit about what I do day to day now, it feels like a sort of six-fold type job, because I'm writing and editing. I'm doing print and online, and doing sort of lifestyle features, but also news features. And I think I started off doing more of the lifestyle side. I now do more of the news features side. And for me, actually, I feel like I've hit a point where I've kind of, it's the perfect balance. News was the beginning of my career. Features is what I moved into. And now I've sort of managed to merge the two. So I get to do those sort of news stories, but more in depth, with a focus on London most of the time. But yeah, really digging into a news story, which to me I much prefer, because you can get the nuance and you can get the sort of human side of any story, whether it's, you know, bed bugs hitting London, or whether it's the fact that London's getting louder, which you were recently quoted
Absolutely.
in, which was fantastic.
That's how we connected. So we'll get on to that, because I think
Totally.
networking and Twitter seems to be a good space
Yes,
into journalism.
absolutely, absolutely.
So when did you graduate from City?
I graduated in 2015, so a really long time ago now.
But we must have therefore crossed paths. And I say that because I went to Cass Business School, which is now based at City,
Yes.
from 2011 to 2015.
Oh, amazing. Yes, we probably 2015. Yeah, so we'd have been there in the same year. How
We
funny.
probably crossed paths in the canteen or the coffee shop at some point.
Exactly, on that
And
pretty little square.
I always find it really, really funny when I interview people and I don't know where their schooling is, but a lot of them are like, "We went to City." I'm like, "Oh, we must have actually been friends or crossed paths, but not necessarily known." We, for the LMF podcast, we actually interviewed Dr. Carolina Are,
Mm.
who I think you might have actually been in a course with, because she was around the same time.
I know the name, but I don't know if I certainly wasn't taught by her.
No, she was a student.
She was a student.
Yeah, so she was also doing her master's at the same time.
Okay. Which course was she doing? Do you know?
Something journalism related. I know it's a podcast,
Okay.
but now she's a PhD student, and on the side she does pole dancing and blogging.
Oh, amazing.
So she was Italian, well, she is Italian. But there's all these like links with university, and I spend a lot of time now back at City or Bays to talk to students and give back, because I think you don't know what you don't know, especially about getting into the industry.
Totally.
The reason I bring that up is because I actually never thought of going into journalism, and I didn't consider myself a journalist. But the interesting thing is that in the last few months, the amount of emails I've got being like, "Oh, you're a journalist, and this is what we want to do with you," or "Let's go for a PR meeting because we want to see who you can write about." I'm like, "No, but I'm not a journalist because I didn't do the degree, so I feel a bit imposter syndrome-ish." Do you think the way into journalism is changing? And I guess my secondary question is, do you agree with the change, given that you had to actually study at university?
Yes and no. So it's a really difficult one, because I think journalists are essentially storytellers and communicators, and we need as many of those as possible. And it's great, I think, that the barriers are coming down, because, oh my goodness, there are so many barriers into journalism. And I know nepotism is rife, and how do you get your first bit of work experience unless your uncle works at the Times or whatever? I remember feeling quite imposter syndrome when I started at City, actually, on my newspaper course. I remember everyone there had done much more high profile journalism work experience than I had. They'd all spent 6 weeks at the Telegraph, and they'd, you know, I remember being really intimidated coming home from that first day. I'd sort of been there mostly doing work experience at my local little newspaper. But what I found really interesting was, by the end of that year and that course, actually, those people who were the loudest and the proudest on day one about their work experience were not the people who were doing the best and who went on to all the big grad schemes. So I think that really taught me to back myself, and actually just to keep plugging along with whatever you're good at and being yourself, and that will hopefully come to fruition. But I know, yeah, I mean, even in the 7 years I've been at the Standard, it's changed enormously. The side I don't like so much is the sort of the crossover with influencing, and I think some people in the younger generations, from conversations I've had with them, have a slightly skewed idea. And having even things like perks and freebies, which I have had a lot of in my 7 years at the Standard, I feel really lucky that I didn't know that that was going to be the case when I went into journalism, because I feel like luckily I went into it for the right reasons. And I do think that side of journalism is slightly more advertised now, and there's a crossover, and I think journalists using social media and things has encouraged that. And I find that sad, because then I do sometimes notice the quality going, and the sort of unbiased nature that some journalists are expected to have sometimes goes with that. So yeah, it's a really mixed bag. But ultimately, I'm glad there are more, that the remit is widening. I just think you have to be careful to keep the quality sometimes.
I really agree with you. Actually, earlier today, I had a interview with Shebs, who is the editor of Voyager Voices, I think is the name of the mag. And he was saying something similar in relation to, there is a difference between journalists and writers. influencers, content creators, and social brands, or individuals that are just going viral overnight.
Absolutely.
And then not necessarily having substance, but then trying to create stories at the back of it. But what he was also mentioning is, especially if you're a woman in this space, you need to know not only what value add you have, but how much you're worth, because people on the other side will try and take advantage of you.
Yes.
And that also isn't key.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's something I talk about with my friends a lot now. We've all just turned 30, and saying, actually, whenever we get imposter syndrome, just to remind ourselves that we actually know a lot now, like in whatever industry we're in. You know, most of us have had sort of nearly 10 years in whatever industry we're in. And I sometimes forget that when I do little workshops for PR agencies and brands and things about how to pitch to a journalist. I'm sort of reminded that actually I do have this wealth of knowledge that to me feels so natural and that I've just sort of picked up. But actually, the journalism industry is a mad world, and if you're not in it, you probably don't know where to start from the outside. So I think just remembering that chances are you do actually have a lot more knowledge and a lot more skills than you necessarily even recognize.
And so when you think about someone entering the industry, and based on your tips and tricks, let's talk about pitching. Like, I think I've said to you from the beginning, I'm not a great pitcher, and I believe I've tried to pitch to you, but it hasn't really worked out. And so that's not, I don't take that personally. I take that as, I need to develop these skills because I didn't do a degree and therefore I don't have the experience behind it. What makes a good pitch as a features editor, but someone who's also commissioning? How do you stand out in your inbox?
Good question. I'm asked this a lot. I think the word that springs to mind immediately is personal. So personalizing whatever pitch you are doing, and that works in both ways. So personalizing it to the brand and the publication and the journalist that you're pitching to. So the number of pitches I get about a restaurant in Manchester is unbelievable when I work for the London Evening Standard, you know, and immediately, you know, you switch off and you're not going to respect any pitch that comes in again from that person because you just think they've not done their research. So not only just as simple as pitching a London story to a London journalist, but more than that, sort of taking a read of the sort of vertical that journalist might write for, and seeing the sort of style that comes in again and again, because most publications do have a really common style. So having a read, getting a flavor, you know, a read over a few weeks just to get a flavor of the kind of things that come up. So that's personalizing it on that side. And maybe when you pitch, rather than just saying, hi, here's a press release, would you like me to write about it? Saying, hi, I've been reading your work for ages. I love what you guys are doing on your style section. I've noticed actually no one's ever written about this before. I'd love to write about this. And then the reason and this is why the personal comes in from your side again, like, this is why I should be the person to write it. Because I have experience in this. Here's some examples of my work. And, you know, here's the personal anecdotes that I'm willing to include. Because I think for us, we have lots of staff writers. Again, I'm speaking very much specifically for the Evening Standard, but I think this is the case for a lot of publications, is that we have a lot of staff writers who are capable of writing those more general features. But actually, the way a freelancer or a new writer or a new voice is going to make their way in is, what are they offering that none of the staff writers have? Maybe they come from a community that none of the staff writers come from, or they've had an experience that they're willing to delve into publicly that none of the staff writers are. So what is that thing? And then what's the sort of peg? What can you relate it to in the news or statistics or time of year or whatever it is? Why are we writing about it now? Is there a celebrity that's talked about that thing and it's a good talking point suddenly? It's hard without specific examples, but I think just making things as personal as you possibly can is the key there.
I've seen a lot of stats recently around the fact that individuals are actually going to like TikTok a lot more than they are reading newspapers or magazines or even Google searches. So obviously you're competing with social media, which wasn't the case, you know, in 2015 or even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago in the same way. Do you feel like it's important for you as a journalist, but also as someone who's, you know, a brand in her own right, to have social media? And do you think that's important to build like opportunities and generate leads? Or, and I guess my secondary point being, or is it more of a distraction because you have a full-time job that you're committed to and you are doing the work?
Very good question. I think it's both. Again, like everything, it's not black and white. It is a big distraction. It's a big extra job. You know, when I write a feature now, there's a million things to do when it's finished. So it's getting it proofed by someone else and edited by someone else, possibly. It's getting it legaled by the legal team. But then that's just the beginning. There is so much more to do on top of that. And a lot of that is the sort of social stuff. How we're going to picture it is obviously always important for a feature. But sometimes how you picture it on social media is very different to how you picture it on just the website or in the paper. And how you sell it on social media is huge. So we're constantly in our features meetings talking about how we're going to sell it on the Evening Standard's official account. But then that's separate to how I sell it on my personal account. And it does depend on what the story is. I've really noticed that. So I do use my Instagram and Twitter a lot to sort of publish my work and share my work. And it does depend on the story as to where I put more emphasis. I mean, I put a lot of stories on both Instagram and Twitter. I get the impression from friends who work in the news and friends who work in features that it's sort of news is a lot more, Twitter's a lot more news focused, and Instagram is a lot better for if you're a features journalist. But saying that, there's pieces I write that do a lot better on Twitter, and there's pieces I write that do a lot better on Instagram. It depends. Kind of often the lifestyle-y stuff and the more human stuff does better on Instagram. The harder news stuff does better on Twitter. But it's a big extra job, and I really struggle because, having brought up the influencer thing with you earlier,
yes,
I think a lot of journalists do a really brilliant job of sort of spanning the two now and being that real persona on social media. Some of my friends in other industries might think that I have this big persona on social media because compared to their jobs, I do use it a lot. But I personally I'm not interested in treading into the sort of influencer doing product reviews on there and going down that line. So I do use it, but I would say in the grand scheme of journalism, I use it quite lightly. Having said that, I know we'll come on to this later, but I'm starting a podcast, which is very exciting. And, using Instagram to plug that, partly because my podcast is very much targeted at the kind of people that follow me, which is my friends and their friends and people, sort of women of my age, I think are going to be the key listeners. And so if I didn't plug it on Instagram, the listener numbers would not be there. It just makes total sense. But I do really struggle because it's kind of trying to keep that integrity and keep a sense of who you are and not be encouraged to post too much or post what you don't feel comfortable with, and keep your personality. And also just not to be dragged down by spending my life on Instagram. My goodness, I don't want to spend any more time on Instagram than I already do. It does bad things to all our brains. So I think that for me, the good far outweighs the bad. I've had some really lovely interactions with my features, really amazing messages, thanks to social media. And also it's a big way I find case studies. I mean, I would really struggle, that's the way we connected, you and I, on Twitter, just putting out a call saying who else is finding it really difficult, how London's got so much louder in the noise pollution. 100%. Where else would I start with case studies? I'd have to go out into the street and start yelling it if I didn't put it on Twitter these days.
That's traditional marketing, right? I do think it's funny you raise that point, because I do think a lot is going back to traditional marketing. So on a side note, we're launching an app which is all about connecting with friends, having career conversations and building your networking circle. That, I think I'm going to go back to traditional marketing and just, wear big banners to be like, looking for friends, come here, or handing out flyers, because there is also so much noise on social media that it's difficult to know. And we're talking about the influencer journalism and that kind of intersects. It's difficult to know, does the journalist or writer actually believe in what they're writing, or are they doing it through like a paid advert and it's been finessed through a gift or a bribe, or a bribe is a strong word, but a gift or like a dinner or a PR invite of some kind. And I think there's a really big blur between like hashtag ad, hashtag gifted, and hashtag a PR person took me out, they paid for my dinner or lunch, and now I'm writing about something, but I can't really open up that kind of worms.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been really lucky over the years. I've managed to go on amazing press trips. I've had amazing products that I've been sent to review and things. And some of them I call in because we want to review them, and some of them I've just been sent. And then suddenly you find yourself getting hounded by whoever has sent it to you saying, where's the coverage? And I can see how easy it is to slip into just, it's really hard to stay neutral, unbiased, to give, the relationships with PRs are really important. And I think that has a good and a bad side as well.
And what are your top tips then working with PRs, especially as a freelancer? So you also commission. So if I give you a scenario, if a PR reached out to me, which they have in the past, to say, we would like you to go and stay in this hotel and review it. And it's based in London. And I come to you and I'm like, oh, I've had a press invite here and the PR wants me to go stay there. I guess at what point is it an advert and at what point is it a true review and experience? And at what point is the PR happy or not happy with the coverage? Because again, everyone has different metrics that they're measuring, including yourselves, because you are a guaranteed big name and publication.
Yeah, I mean, I've done lots of travel pieces, to use travel as an example, over the last 7 years. And my goodness, when I first started, I was like, what is this world? I'd done news until that point. My first ever press trip was to the Maldives, which was completely nuts because I think some people work for 10
That
years.
is a nuts
Don't manage
first
to go
press
to the
trip.
Maldives.
Amazing.
So yeah, I was very lucky. And it's hard because at that point, I'd not been to many bougie hotels in my life. That wasn't what my family did and my friends did, and it's not what I could afford. So naturally, I think my reviews will have become more critical as I go on, which I do not think is a bad thing. And it's difficult. I have great relationships with PRs now, and as a result, I've had amazing experiences through it. But I do take a lot of care to make sure that my reviews are balanced. And, you know, there've been a few places I've stayed at recently that, you know, I have to keep reminding myself, the person who's staying here is not staying here for free. They're paying £1,000 a night. Oh my goodness, actually, I wouldn't be happy with this service or whatever it is. And it can feel really strange when that PR who's become a friend of yours has set you up as a, you know, favor, maybe quite last minute to send you there. But, you know, your job as a journalist is to be a journalist and not just an influencer. Not that influencers can't be critical either, of course, but I think it's really, really important to maintain that, because if you lose that, you know, people aren't going to go to your work. They're going to quickly lose respect for your work, and you definitely don't want that.
And also when you commission individuals then, and let's say they're staying on press trips or they're going on this travel trip, there needs to be both a unique angle, but do they need to disclose to you that it's a press trip and so someone is actually sending them somewhere? Because I've seen a good example is I write for the Lonely Planet now, which is amazing because that's like a massive name. But I know, speaking to the editors, that they don't want to commission press trips, and also they don't want to commission in general. They reach out to journalists versus the other way around. But then PRs now have seen my name on Lonely Planet and they're reaching out to me to be like, can you cover a hotel in Lonely Planet? I'm like, I can, but if there's a unique angle, not just coverage for the sake of coverage.
Exactly. I mean, at the Standard, again, every publication does it differently, but we use freelancers for a fair number of things. We use them all the time for news features and beauty features and all kinds. But with travel, you know, we're not just sending freelancers around the world willy-nilly. They need to have, again, why are we sending them rather than a staff writer? What are they bringing? Maybe they are a cycling expert and we don't have one in the office, or maybe they are really, they stayed there 10 years before and they're going to do a comparison or something like that. There needs to be a reason we're commissioning that freelancer, because I think press trips, I don't know, I think it can get a bit grabby these days with things like that. And again, we have to make sure we're not just sending people out across the world and losing any sense of voice that we have, hopefully, as writers, and sort of style. And yeah, I think that's kind of something that's
Have you been on any negative like PR or press trips, or any of your like, you know, bits that you've been invited to? And I only ask that because I had the pleasure of interviewing the editor of Hello Mag a couple of weeks ago, and she said that she went on an experience where it was herself or someone in her workplace. I don't quite remember, but she said it was, you know, very male dominated. It was very uncomfortable, and also they didn't set the agenda up properly, and so there was a lot of waiting around and not much positive experience that they could write about. And she didn't know how to handle that situation, especially because she's a woman. It was one of her first. She didn't want to let anybody down, but also she didn't want to let herself down either.
Yeah, it can be really difficult. I mean, the one example that springs to mind is something I can't speak a huge amount about because it was something that happened to another journalist when I was on a press trip, and it was one of my first, and I was very junior. And it was an awful thing that happened, and I can't go into details, but all I can say is it put me in a really strange position. I think quite a few of us on the trip felt the same. It put us all in a really strange position. There was no protocol for what happened. None of us felt we could write anything negative, but we didn't also think we could write something positive. So we actually all just chose not to write it in that instance. But that was a conversation I had with my travel editor at the time, who also had never come across that situation. But I think sometimes it is just the case that you choose not to write about something. And I think a lot of the time, you know, the PR will be grateful that you're not writing something negative. But if you look at the Evening Standard's website, it's not our style. You know, I know that some critics, some publications, it would be their style to go and rip into a restaurant or into a hotel. That's not the Evening Standard style. You know, occasionally, if it's a London restaurant that's really notorious and we want to send our top food critic there to go and review it, then that's one thing he might be negative. But if it's me going to a random hotel in Spain, let's say, that, you know, our hotel reviews tend to be quite aspirational and quite, you know, here are our recommendations. So it wouldn't really be suitable to just sort of lay into a random hotel in Spain.
As yourself, as Katie, so outside of the Evening Standard, I guess, from the point of going to City University and then going into your journalism career and progressing, how important have networks and mentors and allies been for your journey? And what are your top tips for anybody who wants to kind of progress in that space but feels like they don't have like a friend in the system?
Really good question. It's actually something I've struggled with a fair bit over my career, because, and friends in other industries are always shocked when I tell them this, that I've never had a sort of appraisal. I've never had a weekly review or a monthly review or that sort of set in stone regular meeting with a boss. It's never happened. And I think that's the nature of, I'm sure some publications are very good at that, but I think the nature of daily newspapers, which is where I've always worked, there isn't time. Every single day you have to get a newspaper out. And that is just the nature of the job. And I'm not saying that's right. And if I ran a newspaper, I hope that I would try and put something in place that meant that people did have that one-to-one time regularly in the diary. But if I've ever had a one-to-one with a peer, with a mentor, with a boss, it's always been something I've had to ask for, and it will often take weeks to get in the diary. And you've got 5 minutes because they've got another meeting in 5 minutes. And that's just been that, you know, there's never been a pay review. There's never been, you know, any pay rise I've had to ask for. Something I have made a real effort to do in the last year, actually, and it was sort of on my New Year's resolutions list, was to just reach out to some journalists that I follow, that I love their writing, that seem to have a very similar outlook to me from what I can tell, and just say, hey, do you want to go for coffee? You know, and it's really simple. And it wasn't a coffee because I was trying to get a job from them, because they're my level at some other publication. But I have made a couple of really great friends through that, and it's helped enormously just to compare notes. And it's not, you know, I'm not going to get anything from it in terms of a job or anything, but it was actually just this week, two of us went for dinner. And we've met 4 or 5 times now over the last year since I first reached out to her. And she was so grateful I'd reached out to her as well. She said she'd been reading my writing, and it was a really nice little sort of relationship we built there. And we just both told each other our salaries for the first time. And that might sound so simple, but I know it's talked about a lot at the moment. And I have no idea what any of my colleagues are on. Probably my own fault for never just asking them, but we're probably all too scared to ask each other.
It's a taboo,
so I have
right?
no
like,
idea.
Sharing is a don't do it.
Yeah,
it's a kind of a don't share salaries. And though it's a different industry, when I used to work in the tech industry, with all due respect, people that shared salaries, I remember even some people like reprimanded for sharing salaries, and they were like taken to the side to be like, don't tell other people what you earn. And it's like, well, that's got nothing to do with you. And legally, no, it doesn't say anywhere that I can't share it. Like, why would you not want to share it if you have that space? And I remember when I started having these conversations with my friends, I'd never be like, what's your salary? I'm like, what is the range that you're paid? Or now as a freelancer, you know, entering the space and growing. Just this morning, I was speaking to somebody who runs a podcast. So I was like, well, I have a travel podcast too. So, oh, you get paid for people to come on? Okay, so what's the general range that you charge for your listeners and your subscribers? Oh, okay, that means I can do that too. And just someone being quite open and honest with you, I think it both is validating, but it gives you something to reach for.
Totally. It's so important to talk about. And I'm very much learning and in the early days of that. And sometimes actually it can surprise you. Sometimes you can share with someone and actually you realize actually what you're on is quite good. It's not always, oh, help, I'm behind everyone. And actually I think that's important too, because you can spend years feeling bitter and thinking everyone else is getting paid more than me. And actually that might not be the case, but it might be as well.
Because you've worked in news for so long, do you get tired of watching the news, reading the news, or do you get tired of like going to an airport because it feels like it's work?
Good question. I do get tired of the news, partly because it is just so depressing, and news is always, unfortunately, quite negatively skewed. But I do think the last few years have been, my word, they've been another level. We were talking about this actually this morning on our features meeting, and just saying something I'm really guilty of is I listen to the Today program every morning when I'm getting ready, and I often listen to a podcast when I'm going in on the tube or cycling in. I often get to work and I realize actually I probably listened to about 5 minutes of that 25-minute podcast. It's so easy to just have all this information going into your brain the whole time. And actually, are you truly listening? And it's just sort of depressing information that's like subconsciously going in. And then you finish your day and you think, why am I feeling so low, or whatever it is? And it's because I've listened to depressing news for the 2 hours between waking up and getting to work. Then I've written about it all day, and same in the evening, maybe when I'm on my run or something. So in COVID, during the pandemic, that did really become a problem. I was home at my parents' house, like so many of us, and I just overworked because I love my job, but I was like, well, there's nothing else to do, so I'll overwork, and writing about negative things all the time. And there was some really negative stuff coming up, and it wasn't just COVID related, was it? There was some really awful stuff during that, and there was all the Sarah Everard stuff I remember specifically. Yeah. And just, that got too much, like for so many of us. So I think it is important. And that's what I love about features. And that's what I'm trying to do a bit more, is not just always choose the negative things to write about, because I have a lot of choice these days, but actually to write some positive things. And again, we can go into my podcast, but that is something I'm trying to do to carve out a bit of joy into my daily week.
And before we jump onto your podcast, I guess one thing that I'd love to know is, how do you then find those moments of silence or space, and how do you actually give yourself time to both just recover and recharge when the job role that you have is in the travel space, the lifestyle space, the news space, the London space, which is also your actual life? So how do you find that kind of, or how do you create that difference between what's your work and what's your reality? Because I can imagine it's quite a blur right now, which probably hurts your brain.
Yeah, I mean, I love that my job feels like my life as well. I do think it's quite tied up with my identity, and sometimes when I have too long off at Christmas and things, I sort of feel a bit lost, which might be a good thing, and it might be a really bad thing. I mean, most of my best friends in life are from school, university, London, flat share years, and actually they're all in really different industries. They're not in journalism. So I think, and I see them a lot in the evenings and weekends. So actually I think that's great, because, you just chat about anything and everything. Having said that, it then gives me great inspiration for features, because we'll talk about things like London getting louder, or a new book, or a new podcast, or just a new talking point, and I'll think, actually, that's a great feature. So that can be a real positive of it. So I'd say, socializing, seeing other people. Exercise for me is number one key. Yeah, I'm a big exerciser, running. And I had to remind myself not to try and listen to a news podcast. I went on a run at lunch today, actually, just before this, and deliberately listen to some happy music and not depressing podcasts, because as much as I love news podcasts, you can't listen to it all the time.
That makes sense. I personally am obsessed with London, and it seems like you are too. And I have always called myself a Londoner, to the extent where I'm really, really lucky now that where I live, I actually manifested when I was like 12, right? I kid you not. So I went to school West London. When we went on a school trip, I think it was like year 8 or year 9, and we went on a school trip to Shakespeare's Globe in like near London Bridge, near Southwark. And they have, near Shakespeare Globe, when you're walking between London Bridge and there, they have the big like boat feature, right? If you know London, you know what that is. And I remember just standing there and being like, and looking across the river and being like, this is where I want to live when I grow up. Like this is my life. And so I have worked, I think, just to get here. So I commuted to, job roles that took 2 hours a day to London, because I was in love with it. I am what I feel like as a pure Londoner, and now I basically live where I said I would. But I find that I don't do the London thing, so I've never been on London Eye, right? And when people are like, what should you do in London? I'm like, don't go on the London Eye. And they're like, what? No, that's what you need to do. I was like, no, it's not, because that's not actually what Londoners do. Like, local Londoners walk everywhere and get lost and, you know, don't worry about basically using like Google Maps. I'm not a big Google Maps user when I'm in London. I'm just like floating around. And also I was after our podcast recording this morning, we were walking around Liverpool Street, and I was like, okay, let's grab a tea or coffee. And they were like, okay, let's go here. And I was like, no, because as a Londoner, I feel very serious about going and supporting the London economy. So I will go and buy from a market or buy from like a family coffee shop or whatever it might be, just to give them some hope, because that I feel is really responsible for me. You have a podcast now all about London.
I do.
Which I think is the most exciting thing as somebody who is trying to be London's ambassador, but you know, TfL and Sadiq Khan is not getting back to me, but that's fine. If I say it enough, they will. Like my life one of my life's goals is to say, please mind the gap on the London Underground.
I love that. I've never even thought about that.
That's just one of my goals in life, and I feel like if I tell enough people, someone will be able to do that for me.
You can make this happen.
Oh my God,
I'll put you in touch with TfL after this.
Oh my God, thank you. I went to UAL, LCF, the London College of Fashion, and their new campus is in Stratford. It's right opposite the TfL office. So all the people that know about this joke, they're like, TfL is just that. Like, you can just go in and talk about
just have to pop in, yeah.
What makes you fall in love with London, and why did you start the podcast?
Good question. I wouldn't say I loved London when I first moved here. I wasn't like you thinking I need to live in London because I love London.
Where did you move from?
I grew up in Hampshire on the south coast, but I went to Durham University and then came down and obviously did my master's at City down here. And it was a means to an end. I mean, it was where I knew I wanted to be, because everyone I knew from school and university was moving to London, and it's where all the jobs were, and definitely journalism jobs. But did I love London? Probably not at that point. I didn't have the money to spend to enjoy it fully. I was in a horrible flat, etc., etc. But do I love it now? Absolutely. I think the moment I feel like a proper Londoner the most is a few days a week when I cycle, and our office was in Kensington for years, but it's now in the city. And I cycle across London Bridge, and often you look to, well, if it's in the morning, if I look to the east, there's the sun rising, and there's all the commuters in their suits. And I know it's very suits and it's very, you know, city. But having not worked in the city until now, to me, that feels very London. You see the river, and to me, the river and that tourist sort of postcard look is real London. And then I'm just really lucky that I get to work for London's newspaper. So I've had all these crazy experiences, good and bad, over the years, which have sort of helped me fall in love with it. You know, again, it's the people. I've had a couple of amazing experiences recently for features where I spent a day with an ambulance crew and a fire crew, and those are the people that feel like real Londoners. And zooming around on the blue lights every day around the streets, and just seeing the way they interact with the public, and that's pretty amazing. And I know that's not just London specific, but I do feel that gives you a real flavour for who Londoners are.
I think so. Super multicultural. I mean, I feel kind of weird saying this out loud, but one of my favorite things to do in London, or one of my like side hobbies, is, I don't know how to present this without sounding weird, is like being on the tube station and people not knowing where to go, and then you can see the people that are lost.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, do you need help? They're like, do you work for TfL? I'm like, I don't, but where are you off to? And I just love helping people figure out their route on the tube map. Like, it's one of those things where I go sit down and I'm literally eyeing for the people that are lost, and I'm like, oh, do you need help? I can help you. Which is the weirdest like hobby to have, but it brings me pride and joy inside. Is to be like
perfect interning for your future career as a mind the gap reader.
So did you pitch your podcast at Evening Standard, or was that something that naturally came about?
Yes, good question. Let's go on to the podcast. So the podcast, for anyone listening, is called London Love Stories, or London Love Stories with Katie Srick, if you're typing it into your podcast app. And the trailer is already out, and it launches on Thursday, the 9th of November. So very, very soon. It's been an idea in my head for years, if I'm honest. So I used to run it as a column in the paper every Monday. And it was called London Love Stories, and it was me interviewing a couple who met in an interesting way, or has a good story for whatever reason. And it was a small little column, but it did get a lot of attention. And I remember I would go to parties and say I worked for the Evening Standard, and a couple of people were like, oh, I love the Evening Standard. I pick it up every Monday because I love that column. And I was like, I wrote that column. And it felt like a really small part of my week back then. You know, it was a small sort of silly, light-hearted, fun column. And it wasn't really a subject that I thought I wanted to make a career out of at all. But it just did so well, and it was so heartwarming, and people just love a love story, and people are nosy. And it was great being able to be nosy as a journalist and just ask these couples all these questions, and people were so happy to share. That column sadly sort of ended for no reason other than just COVID coming along and the paper shrinking overnight. And ever since then, really, I've sort of spent every new year going on a walk with my family saying, this is the year I'm going to launch it as a podcast. This is the year. And last Christmas, I just heard myself say it to my dad one last time. And I was like, right, this has to be the year. I'm not waiting another year. And, you know, as a journalist, you can have your own projects on the side. So I've been wondering whether to do it with the Evening Standard or without. And it suddenly became obvious. What am I doing? I should obviously do this with the Evening Standard. It's the most London Evening Standard thing there is. We have recording studios and producers ready to go. We can help to find, that can help me to find these couples, that can help with advertising. And so I pitched it in January to our podcast editor, and I was really nervous, and I had this big pitch, and I was ready to sort of hit him with all these quotes and facts and tell him it was going to be like London's version of Modern Love, which is in New York for the New York Times. And I didn't even have to get that far. He was like, say no more. I love it. It's amazing. Go make it. And I was like, what? I've never made a podcast before. I don't know how to do that. And he was like, I'll give you a producer. Here you go. Her name's Rochelle. She's great. And she is great. And off you go. So, I mean, it was January and we're now in November. So that gives
I was going to say, it's a long time coming. So when did you actually start recording, and how do you balance that with your actual day job?
I think that's been the challenge, right? It's not like I've been working on this full time since January. It began by being a sort of evenings, lunch breaks, spare moments thing, because my day job as a feature writer and editor is pretty intense. But then it's been a case of trying to convince various editors and powers that be, because, you know, a newspaper or a publication like the Evening Standard is so much more than the newspaper these days. There's video team, podcast team, online, you know, there's the paper, there's so many different sort of sections and editors and people trying to get each other's attention. And to me, I always knew this had potential to be something all those sections could cover in a big way. And it's more than just a podcast. It leads into features and all kinds of things. But it's taken a while to sort of convince various people and get people's attention. And we've had a new editor in that time and things. And also, I think you need to have, the proof is in the pudding, as it were. You need to go and show someone an episode. This is what it's going to sound like. So that was the first challenge, was just going away and making our perfect episode and then showing it to people. And it's not like showing someone a piece of writing where you can put it literally in front of them. You have to literally go and put some headphones on someone if you want them to listen to a podcast. So that was a challenge for a while, but I think everyone is suitably on board now. And I'm really excited because it's basically me interviewing couples who met in fascinating ways. So our first episode is obviously a couple that met on the tube, because it had to be. But we've got, you know, policemen and a paramedic who met on a 999 job, which sort of feeds into what I was saying earlier about ambulance crews and things. We've got old couples, young couples. We've got people who started as housemates, all kinds of just like different ways that people can meet, but crucially in person, pretty much. And I think with dating apps and things, it's just really refreshing to hear of these real life meet cutes. And, you know, we didn't want them all to just be cheesy, happily ever after, you know, fairy tale type stories as well. We have made sure that people are willing to talk about their challenges and breakups and difficult parts of relationships, because I don't want it to be some cheesy thing that only smug couples in relationships want to listen to, or single people thinking, oh, I need hope. I want it to sort of be for everyone. And I, who sort of backed it from the start, has been pleasantly surprised at how much I've sort of learned about more than just love, but sort of life, people, Londoners, our city, everything really. It's been really,
what are some of
really wonderful.
What are some of the top themes or top tips that we can probably take away from the podcast? And obviously for everyone watching, there'll be links in the bio and the description so they can take a listen. But what are some like key themes that you found quite fascinating?
I have found, I think, not planning things, like opposites can attract. I found like there's a couple of couples, and I don't want to give too many spoilers away, who were just so unlikely. They had completely opposite political views. They had opposite this, opposite that, very different jobs. There's no reason that they would have ended up together, and they certainly wouldn't have ended up together on an app. they wouldn't have been each other's tick box partner, which is, I think, a really difficult thing for a lot of people on the apps to hear, because you're thinking, well, how do I meet them then? Do I just have to wait till someone falls into my lap? But I think it's been a real lesson in just like living your life and going about those things you'd want to be doing anyway, no matter what, whether it's just getting into a new flat share, even if you're in your 30s, it doesn't have to be a thing you're doing when you're 21, or just moving to a different city because it's where you want to be, or starting a new job and just doing you. And it's just amazing how those moments do fall into people's lives in a way that they're not expecting. And those people that they have chemistry with, there's often no rhyme or reason. And if they hadn't been on that district line carriage that day, they would never have met. And there's a magic in that, and it's amazing. And that actually leads me into the other biggest learning I've probably had, is that like love and relationships are a choice. And even though there are these very magical sliding doors sort of moments people have on public transport, their eyes locking across a tube carriage, there is still a choice even in that story. It's the choice of one of them to go up to the other one and start a conversation or give them each other's number. It's the choice of that person to text that number and lean into that thing. And I think one thing I've really realized is that we all have these opportunities, and it doesn't have to be romantic relationships. It could be a professional one, it could be a friendship, it could be whatever. They are actually in our lives every day, pretty much, if you're out there in London. It's just what you choose to do with them. And and that sounds so cliche and so cringe, but I think a lot of people wait around thinking, well, why hasn't my love of my life met me on the tube, or like come up to me on a bus or something? And actually, I think it's not always about that. It's not about waiting around. It's about these little golden moments we all have in our lives, and little run-ins, and trying to remember to look up from our phones. And yeah, listening to a podcast. I know I'm launching a podcast, and that's part of the problem is everyone's plugged in. But I do think there's something hopefully very feel good about listening to these stories and just thinking, actually, it is still happening. There are these amazing relationships. And I think the first series is all very much focused on romantic relationships, but the second one, we're going to broaden it out, because there are amazing love stories in London that aren't romantic.
Absolutely. One thing you said at the start of the conversation was, in your 30s, life feels a little bit different right now versus your 20s. I too feel that. So I am now in my 30s, and I feel a lot more different than I did in my 20s. I think in my early 20s, I found a sense of self and I found confidence. And then somewhere in my 20s, I lost it because of the world and society and work and conforming and pressures. And now in my 30s, I don't know, I kind of woke up and I was like, I don't owe anyone anything. Everything you do is a choice, like as long as you're doing what makes you happy, but also sitting in silence is just as good, and spending time alone is great. And you don't need to be this massive socialite, but you can, I really, for me in my 30s, an example of just even reaching out to you was because I'm trying to be bolder in a different way. I'm trying to create good, long-lasting relationships, not to want anything from anyone, but to get to know people who are maybe in a similar journey, but in a different industry. Or it might be to spend more time alone, because I absolutely love to talk for a living, but actually you need to listen, you need to be silent. Or lastly, it's, talking about London and traveling and exploring, it's not being afraid to go down a different route or try something new, and really incorporating that sense of failure and that sense of, well, freedom is being able to fail and then picking yourself back up and just trying it again. So what are some ways that you think maybe you've evolved, or, since you've turned 30 and now you're like, oh, why was I not like that before?
Yeah, really good question. It's so funny. So my 30th birthday was in August just gone, so not that long ago. And as an August baby, I'm used to all my friends turning that age before I have, which is always quite nice. And it was funny because there's obviously that cliche of you turn 30 and you know who you are suddenly. But like, it really did. So many friends who aren't normally into these sort of cliche sayings were coming up to me on the day, and they were like, I'm so excited for you. Don't you just feel a weight off? Don't you know who you are now? Like, you just don't, the 20s aren't all as sunshine and rainbows as everyone likes to make out. And every single person said that same thing to me as I was turning 30, which I found really funny. And it is true. I think there's a reason everyone's saying it. I think there's a lot of negativity around turning 30 and certain goals you should have achieved, which I know I'm not saying anything new here, but I've really enjoyed my 30s so far. And I actually moved into this new flat share that I'm in now a month later, so just under a month after my 30th birthday. And I never thought I'd be moving into yet another flat share I thought I'd be doing that at 21 or in parts of my 20s. And I've been really lucky. I've had some amazing flat share experiences. Some of my best friends have been through flat shares in London. But I didn't think I'd be moving into another one now. And this was the first one where I hadn't sort of been forced out. It wasn't COVID that had forced me out or the end of a tenancy. It was just me thinking, I need to change from where I currently am. I just think I need a bit of a shake up, new people, having a garden, things like that. And it was the best decision. And I was actually, this friend I met up with earlier this week, who's another journalist who I'd reached out to, like you said you did with me. We had a really interesting conversation literally just on Tuesday, just gone. She was saying, oh, she's owned her house in North London for a while, or her flat, sorry. And she was like, oh, I'm really tempted to move south, but I just don't know. And I did say to her, I said, is that because you pictured at 30 your next move would be for that person you're going to meet, that person you're probably going to spend the rest of your life with? Is that what you pictured, that you'd wait around? It's sort of in this holding pen before you meet them, and any next big decision you make will be because of them. And she was like, yeah, actually. I said to her, well, please use me as an example, because I think it's very easy to think like that. And I'm so glad I made this move that I have made, and made great new friends, and it's just that new lease of life. And actually, I think some people think they should just sort of give up, and by 30 those decisions have been made. And actually, I think it's just proof to, you do know who you are, so you're a great new asset to a new set of friends and housemates, and or whatever it might be. That's just my example, but
of course,
I'm really enjoying it. And work-wise as well, I'm lucky that I'm doing a job that I adore. But even if I wasn't, I would say to someone, don't think just because you're 30 and you've been in one industry so far that you can't switch. I think that's been a real thing to me. And even me starting a podcast, I'm not a podcaster by trade, and it's not my background, but it's something I wanted to do for ages. And I think that sort of, sometimes the ticking clock of 30 is good, because it makes you sort of, right, I can't get to next Christmas without having done this bucket list.
Absolutely.
Thing. So for me,
and you learn new skills and you build the confidence. It's interesting because I recently turned 31, and I'm only sharing this because if you type my name in, Google's already sharing it, right? So it's not like I have a choice. It's just Google's told everyone how old I am before I have. And it's funny because my sister messaged me a few months ago and she's like, I think you've psyched yourself out being 30.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, no, I think you're overthinking it. I think you're trying to adult too much. Like you can still be fun and you can still figure things out, and you don't have to have it all sorted. So in my mind, I'm like, I'm 30, I'm confident, I'm ready. But I think outwardly what I was displaying was, I'm stuck. I'm trying to figure it out. I don't quite know who I am, and I'm navigating this new space. And I started taking life a bit more seriously. And she's like, early 20s, she's like, you've loved being 30, but unfortunately your output, be that on socials or be that through written text or be that through your conversation, doesn't really display the newfound love that you have for yourself. And so I think one thing for anyone and everyone listening is, it's okay to take a step back, but it's also okay to rebrand yourself, is maybe what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I didn't really think of it like that. But now that you've turned 30 and you've started a new podcast, and you're still, and you're a senior features editor at Evening Standard, and you've got this whole new lease of life, how do you think that you are going to both kind of figure out those stuck moments, but kind of rebrand yourself to this new decade? Because that's currently where I'm at, is I'm like, oh, I've got a whole new decade to play with. Where do I want to be when I'm 33, 35, like 40? How do I want to start my 40s? And so let me work backwards, versus being in a position where you're comparing that level of freedom you might have had at 21, but you don't have the privilege, the power, or the finances.
Really good question. I've always lived my career so far not having big 5-10 year plans. There's no way 5 or 10 years ago I'd have thought, maybe 5, because I was actually still at the Evening Standard, but 10 years ago I was doing a completely different thing, and I really didn't think I'd be here doing this. So I actually think there is a danger sometimes. I think in some industries it works to have that, and it's obvious the progression, so you can aim for those things. But what I've actually kind of loved about journalism and media is that you can sort of wiggle your way around and do all these different things. And yes, my job title hasn't changed like hugely over the years, but within that, what I'm doing is quite different. And my job title is still senior features editor, but I've launched this podcast within that, and that's something, I had these little goals, and I think having these little goals are really great. But I think sometimes those pressures to have really big goals is a bit dangerous. Having said that, I had a dad who always just told me to aim high, and it was like, oh no, I'm never gonna get into that college at Durham because it's the best one, it's the hardest one to get into. And he forced me to apply, and I was lucky enough to get it. And I think I've tried to remember that through the years, and it's definitely advice I would give to my children if I ever have them, is just someone's got to get that thing and aim high. And there's someone very exciting I wanted to get as an interviewee for my podcast, for example, and a few people were like, you'll never get this person, of course you won't. And I was very satisfied the other day, after months of trying, that we've had a yes from that person. So I won't spoil it, but I think that's been a really good thing for me, is just to aim high. So I think, if someone's entering a new decade and they've got a secret little dream that they wouldn't tell anyone, like what's that little dream that like it's a bit embarrassing, but it crosses your mind if you're awake at night, because you probably can make it happen, and like someone's got to do it.
It's good. Well, when you get 31, you'll be like, what's the worst that can happen attitude? And now I'm like trying to just do as much as I can. And so my final question to you is, there'll be a lot of 20-year-olds, a lot of early 20, mid-20s watching. What is your advice to your younger self in your early start of your 20s, in your early start of your career? And, that student that was just hungry and ambitious, but a little bit afraid and had imposter syndrome.
Yes, very good question. I don't think I'd tell myself to do anything too differently, but just to have more confidence when doing it. And that's, what a lot of people I'm sure would say. If I could, I did my city course, and I was one of the ones lucky enough to get onto that grad scheme at the end that many of us had applied for. But I didn't have the confidence that I would get it in the way that some of those people did at the beginning. And perhaps, that helps to an extent. I think actually, certainly at the Daily Mail, they weren't trying to hire people who would be big and bullshit on the front doorstep. They were trying to get those people who are maybe a bit more sensitive, and maybe sensitivity can come with a bit more, a bit less confidence, but actually I think a bit more confidence would have been good for me earlier on. So that I would say, and then just your average 20 something or teenager who wants to go into journalism, it is hard, and I think it's scary if your family doesn't have connections and ways in. I was lucky that we had a sort of loose family flat in London that I could live in for a few months, and I thank goodness that we did, because I wouldn't have been able to do the masters without it. But I was unlucky in that I had no relative whatsoever that had ever done journalism. My parents didn't have a clue, so they've never been able to give me advice on that. They've always said, we encourage you, but good luck. We can't give you any advice. So that hopefully I'm proof that you don't need those family connections. And I think it's just all about, if you don't ask, you don't get. So just emailing your local newspaper or magazine enough times that they have to say yes eventually, or just going along and speaking to them in person. I was at an event the other day for sixth formers, talking to them about journalism. And I said to quite a few of them sitting there, I was like, you just have to ask. You just have to ask. I said what I'm saying to you. I was like, if you don't ask, you don't get. And it was interesting because they were all nodding along, and it was only the people that were interested in journalism that were sitting with me. And then it was actually only one girl that came up to me at the end and said, so I'm here, I'm asking, like, can I have some work experience? Bless her. I think she was 16. She was very young. And we wouldn't normally take a 16-year-old at the Evening Standard. But I was so happy that she did come up and ask when none of her peers did. And she took that advice very literally. And she didn't even have an email address. So she was having to email me from her mum's email address. But she came in for a week of work experience. And it just was really lucky timing that she came in the same week that we were doing something about schools. And she ended up having a feature with her picture in the paper, and much more than any 16-year-old would normally get doing work experience for us. But that was absolutely just proof of you don't ask, you don't get. And she just, she wasn't actually full of confidence, as many 16-year-olds aren't, but she did all the right things. And hopefully having that on her CV will set her in amazing stead if she does want to go into the industry. So I just say, just don't take no for an answer, and just ask enough, and write if that's what you love doing. And you'll get there. There will be a door that will open.
My gosh, I love that advice. I also think that's such a nice, lovely story to share, and a great ending. So Katie, obviously you've shared your podcast, but if anybody wants to connect with you, where can they find you? How can they follow you? And also, where can they listen to your podcast when it comes out?
Thank you for asking. Podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. I personally listen to them on Spotify. So if you just type in London Love Stories with Katie Srick, you will find it. And there's a nice orchestral trailer for you to listen to as a teaser. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Katie_Strick, I believe, or it might be __ on Instagram. But yeah, if you type in my name, I should be there.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And we'll, for anyone and everyone watching, please listen to the podcast. I've also linked it in the comments, depending on where you're watching, and also linked all of Katie's socials so you can give her a follow and take her advice. If you don't ask, you don't get. So if you're trying to get into journalism, just go and read the relevant material, reach out to people and ask for experience. If you're trying to start a podcast, don't worry about not having the skills, but have a unique angle. And when you are in the world, given that everything is going on, good or bad, yes, keep up to date with what's happening, but also make sure that you keep time for your friends, your family, your loved ones, and those moments of silence, because they will be your greatest life lessons.
Perfect summary. Thank you.